Okay, and so a little background for Julie. For the past 20 years, she's been the first and only executive director of the Community Foundation of Grundy County. She's taken the foundation's assets from 0 to 15 million and has ingrained the foundation as a partner throughout the region. The Community Foundation of Grundy County is in compliance with national standards and has set the following 2023 strategic grant-making priorities. Number 1 being mental health, and 2, out-of-school hours programming for children and families. Throughout her career, Mrs. Buck has served on the boards of a number of nonprofits and professional associations. Most recently, she serves on the board of directors of the Chicago Council on Planned Giving and is co-chair of CCPG's annual Day of Learning Symposium. Julianne teaches a certificate of nonprofit administration at Joliet Junior College and is a member of a 6-consultant team teaching a certificate of chamber and nonprofit leadership via the Kokomo Thriving Center and Indiana Wesleyan University. In order to share her knowledge and expertise outside of Grundy County, Julianne has launched Nonprofit Brains and Brawn, a consulting firm dedicated to nonprofits, donors, and professional advisors. And she became a chartered advisor in philanthropy in 2020. So we're fortunate to have her here today to present on volunteer board governance. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Julie, and I will pull up her slideshow in just one sec. Okay, can everybody see this? Great. I'm gonna move this down. Okay, so Julie, do you want me to move to the second slide, I'm assuming?
Sure. The second slide, the one of my photo, just kind of gives a little background for the audience. At 11:30, I started to log in and Zoom said, no, you got to download. So I did. So anyway, so I'm a Morris native and rural America is very important to me. And I've lived and worked in big cities, but when this position came open, I dragged my husband kicking and screaming from Chicago, and now he loves it. And we've been out here for 20 years. So I've been in nonprofit administration practically my entire life, career, fundraising, all that other good stuff. And next slide, because we already went through that in the intro. So why are we here today? First of all, Grundy County does not have a 708 board, and I'm very envious of those of you who do have one, and especially Livingston and some of the other counties who started their 708 boards way back in the 60s when the state legislature authorized them. So I'm very envious, and our county health administrator and I have been meeting with some of you and attending some of your meetings to get our ducks in a row to try and someday get a 708 here in Grundy County. But with our current county board mentality about taxes, I don't know that it will ever happen. So plus we at the Community Foundation do a lot of mental health convening, funding, grant making, et cetera. So in some ways, our two organizations are very similar. We are grant makers. And I know that a lot of what I present today, you're going to say, well, we're not a nonprofit. We are a local unit of government, and I understand that. But there are going to be many things where we are similar. Sorry, I'm talking beyond my slides. So the slide here, regardless of whether your organization is a 501 or a local unit of government, you have boards that are made up of volunteers. And that's what today's presentation is about. So next slide. So my question to you as a local unit of government, do you want to do only what's legally required per the statute, or do you want to expand your best practices to more fully serve the citizens who participate in the services provided by the agencies that you fund? Next slide. So how are we a little bit different? 501c3s are subject to the Illinois Nonprofit Corporation Statute, but we are private 501c3s. We are not local units of government. Therefore, we are not subject to the Open Meetings Act. And we do not have to complete some of the annual paperwork that you all have to, such as your statement of economic interest. Next slide. So today's training is really going to be some of it for you as a 708 board. Some of it you're going to be able to convey to the nonprofits that you fund. And I think you should, as a 708 board, I think you should be aware of some of the requirements of a private 501c3 nonprofit so that when they are applying to you for grants, you have some education and awareness under your belt so that you can better evaluate whether they are a good recipient of the grant funds. Next slide. So because of that, today's presentation is going to be very fluid, going back and forth between 708 and 501c3 and different and similar and stuff. But in the big picture of life, it all boils down to the fact that both a 708 board and a nonprofit, it's all about public trust. Are you taking tax dollars and using them wisely? Are you taking donor dollars and using them wisely? And both sides of the coin want to assure that the citizens you serve who access the services that you fund through the agencies to make sure that the citizens are well served. Next slide, please. Let's get started. Next slide. There are 3 duties of care in the nonprofit board world. I use these quite a bit. They are a good short reminder to volunteer boards why they are there and their main responsibilities in life in the big picture. Next slide. The first one is a duty of care. Every volunteer board is to take care of the organization by ensuring prudent use of all assets, including facility, people, and goodwill. Next slide. Number 2 is the duty of loyalty. Ensure that the organization's activities and transactions are first and foremost advancing its mission, recognizing and disclosing conflicts of interest, making decisions that are in the best interest of the organization, not in the best interest of the individual board member or any other individual or for-profit entity. Next slide, number 3, the duty of obedience. Ensure that the organization obeys applicable laws and regulations, follows its own bylaws or you guys' statute, and that the organization adheres to its stated corporate purposes and mission. Again, you're not a private corporation 501c3, but you are a standalone organization, local unit of government. Next slide. So where did I get the 3 duties? From the Council on Nonprofits website. So yes, this is being recorded, and afterward, I'll ask Jody to forward this to you as PDF handouts, and you'll be able to make copies of it and share with others and follow through on some of these links. Next slide. So the rest of my presentation is about what I'm calling it the Purple Book. So a couple of decades ago, the Illinois Attorney General put together a charitable trust bureau, and it has an advisory committee, and it's made up of a number of nonprofits from across Illinois, and that committee still exists. The Charitable Trust Bureau does still exist. So ages ago, they put together this Illinois Nonprofit Principles and Best Practices. And in the early days, it had a purple binder. And so a lot of us old timers, we still call it the Purple Book. And a lot of people know what we mean, but it's not purple anymore. And here's the link for you to download your own copy. So this is what we're going to run through today. So next slide. So I'm not going to run through every single one. There are 13, I guess, sections. And then within it, it has A and B or A through J or whatever the case may be. So I've kind of pulled out the most relevant ones. And then when you download your own copy, you'll be able to go through all of them. And again, back to the nonprofits who accept your grant money this could be a very good booklet for you to present to them. Again, to assure that they are operating at their highest capacity, because you want to make sure that the grant money you give them is well used. So section number 1, nonprofit has a clearly stated charitable, education, or scientific mission that has been approved by the governing body and is in pursuit of the public good. I know that you're 708 boards and not 501c3s, but I do think this section is still relevant. Next slide. Even if you're not required to, I would think that the 708 board would want to put together a vision and a mission. And when you're out and about in the nonprofit world, they quite often say mission and vision, and I think it should be vision and mission first. And a vision is just your big picture of life, you know, the kind of the joke, especially if you've seen the movie Miss Congeniality. Oh, world peace, I really do want world peace. That's fine. That's a vision. So how do you envision the county where your 708 board is operating? Do you envision a county where no citizens go without mental health services? So that type of big picture thinking that your board could go through. I've seen nonprofits who have these types of vision statements: a community without hunger, 0 unplanned pregnancies, a vibrant community that appreciates art in all its form. A fellow community foundation out on the East Coast 20 years ago, in one summer, had 6 drownings, and that is for them absolutely unacceptable. And so it wasn't a mission of their organization, but it was a vision of one of their programs, that from here on out, there will be 0 drowning in our community. And so they put money toward swim lessons, lifeguard training, buddy systems, all those types of things. So the vision was no more drowning. Then the mission is actually the action verbs that you're going to implement in order to make that vision come to a reality. So action words like promote or engage or serve, educate. A lot of nonprofits make that mission so long, and I don't know that you need to do that, but that's a totally different presentation. Next slide. So where is all this stated, and how often does your board look at it and discuss it and things like that? I recommend once a year. Depending on how small you are, you could do it every few years. For the most part, it's not going to be edited very often, but you do want to make sure that you're doing a gut check and checking back in that the activities of the organization are fulfilling the vision and the mission of the organization. Next slide. Mission drift, you hear this in the nonprofit world. We start off, we're going to be a food pantry, and next thing you know, we're doing animal rescue. Well, wait a minute. Those are 2 different missions. If your organization has the big mission that you're going to serve humans and animals, that's fine. But if your mission is only to serve humans and you start doing an animal rescue, then you've drifted away from your mission and you need to pull it back. This could be something that you watch regarding your grant recipients. They may have mission drift, and so not that you have to deny them a grant, but you need to remind them they need to rein themselves back into either their original mission, or they need to, as a nonprofit board, edit their mission and go through the process of expanding it. Next slide. Section 2 says the role, responsibility, selection, and tenure of the governing body are clearly stated in the organization's governing and policy documents and understood by the governing body members. Big difference here between a 708 board and a nonprofit board. A nonprofit board, we get to go out and pick and vote on the people that we want to serve on our board. You guys are different. They can be local units of government, I'm just going to say in the broad sense, are either they are elected like city council, they are appointed like our fire district trustees are appointed. I think you 708 boards are appointed. So you kind of don't have a choice of who serves, but if they are elected or appointed, I would think that you are out and about networking and trying to identify people that will serve if called upon, so that when it's time for an appointment, that you get appointed the people that you know are going to be a good fit to your organization. And I know politics get into it. Next slide. So whether it's your bylaws or your statutes, you should have board member job descriptions, board officer job descriptions, a specific list of the tasks and roles of the board at a bare minimum. Obviously, there's going to be more tasks and roles, but you need the bare minimum. If you're going to have committees, what are their purpose? In the nonprofit world, well, and you guys too, there are qualifications to be a board member. First one may simply be geography. You have to be a resident of the county in order to serve on that 708 board. How are they selected? How are the officers selected? Length of terms, and a huge one. What are the steps for the removal of a board member? Yeah, I could ramble on that for a long time, but sometimes you get a board member who is, not that they're being rowdy or pushy or anything like that, because sometimes we need dissension among the troops in order to have really robust conversations, but you don't want them doing anything that is shady or illegal. Next slide. If you don't have this yet, you can just Google, but on board effect, I found a really good cheat sheet on Robert's Rules of Order. So if you need one of those, and then I think you need to compare and contrast that with the Illinois Open Meetings Act, because you don't want to violate that. And does Robert's Rules of Order pair well with that, or are there some places where they are divergent and you need to make sure that you follow the Open Meetings Act as opposed to the Robert Rules of Order? Next slide. So this is something that a lot of us nonprofit CEOs and board chairs are starting to use. It's called a why agenda. It gets back to mission drift. Only items that need action and discussion should be on the agenda, and some of them only belong there a certain time of year. So for example, my 501c3, our fiscal year is December 31st, and so our 990 is due to the feds by May 15th. So come July, August, September, et cetera, the 990 should not be on my agenda because it's the wrong time of year. For a nonprofit who has a fundraiser coming up. But really the question is, why are we having a golf outing? Are we having it because we really need the money and we need the income? Or are we having a golf outing because it's a pet project of one of our board members and it really drums up more business for his private company than it does for the nonprofit who's the quote unquote beneficiary? So why is something on the agenda? Definitely state statute, time for grant applications, time for grant awards, time for scholarships. Just asking the executive and the board chair to be more thoughtful about what goes on the agenda and why. And then you've got these other categories, these other columns. For anyone who has to take minutes, sometimes that could be difficult. What's the result? But then the last two columns, who's responsible for it and what's the due date? I myself, even with my organization, I'll go back and I'll start typing the minutes. I'm like, oh, that was an action step and I can't remember who volunteered for it. It helps keep people on track when they are responsible for getting something accomplished. Next slide. This may be moot to most of you, but this is how I track my board members, their terms, officers, that kind of stuff. So when you get the handouts later and you want to study this, you can. Next slide. 2.1 also requires you to provide oversight on your chief your lead staff, I don't know if you call them a CEO, I don't know if you call them an executive director. The naming is a little bit interchangeable, but you're talking about the highest level of paid staff. And I'm not even going to say highest paid staff, because I've been around nonprofits where they have an attorney on staff who makes more than the CEO. So you don't want to say the highest paid. You want to say the highest level ranking person. So your board is in charge of hiring, firing, supervising, reprimanding, rewarding the highest level executive. Who's in charge of the day-to-day operations? Next slide. Section 3 says the governing body ensures that its members are competent and knowledgeable, and includes and seeks diverse points of view and experience as needed to provide credible and effective oversight of all aspects of the nonprofit's work. So next slide. A nonprofit does this type of attribute chart, and a local unit of government might do it as well, especially if you're countywide. You probably want to make sure that you have representation from all geographic areas. You may find that, like here in Grundy County, I think we're 84% white, but then the next is Latino at 11%. So most of us nonprofits want to make sure that we include Latino voices. For those of you who serve organizations and provide mental health services, you may want someone from the consumer side of the house, someone who either has a mental health diagnosis or a family member, somebody like that. So keep this in mind as you go forward about your board makeup. Next slide. Board training and orientation. I'm sorry to say Google it, but I gave you some resources here of the bigger nonprofit resource organizations and or consultants like Joan Gary type of thing. So lots of assistance out there. And I don't know whether a 708 board would ever do a board retreat. It doesn't have to be a big fancy, it could be in the day, it could be a half day, it could be an evening, it could be a Saturday, but just 3 to 4 hours minimum. Of course, you guys probably would have to do it in conjunction with the Open Meetings Act. So maybe this is not a good idea for your 708 board, but it is a question that you could ask your grantees if they do board orientation when they bring new board members on, et cetera. So for example, my board elections are in October, and at the November board meeting, we do an orientation. And everybody, the entire board is there because the new ones need to be oriented and the older board members need a refresher course type of thing. Next slide. Section 4 talks about the governing body regularly assesses the organization's mission and the effectiveness of the organization, its leadership, and its programs in achieving the mission. Next slide. So you want to do evaluations as individual board members. I think attendance can sometimes be really crappy among local units of government as well as nonprofit boards. Mine is the third Thursday. My board meeting is the third Thursday, and I'm amazed at how many board members over the years have said, oh yeah, we're on vacation that week. Okay, you did not have on your calendar that it's a third Thursday? So some board members do it once in a blue moon, others do it constantly, and it goes back to the culture that you set at your organization about attendance and things. Participation outside of meetings, especially for a nonprofit, let's say we're having a golf outing. If nobody from the board shows up at the golf outing, that's a pretty poor showing to the public and to the donors and the that are there. And then how do individual board members walk the talk of the 3 duties of care: loyalty, obedience, and it's the other one slipping my mind. So anyway. How about the board as a whole? How can they be evaluated? What is their effectiveness, their impact in the community, their financial oversight. If they get really kind of lackadaisical about the financials, and then 6 months later you find that there's a problem, that's going to reflect poorly on whether it's the 708 board, whether it's one of your nonprofit grantees. And again, I'm just going to bump you to Google. If you just Google nonprofit board evaluation, you're going to find all sorts of examples and templates. Next. Strategic planning. This is a huge thing in the nonprofit world. I don't know how much you do with it as a local unit of government, but collectively agreeing on where you want to go. I was at my national conference last week, and someone replaced the word strategic planning with shared future. What is the future of our county 3 years from now? What do we want it to look like? And then what are the short-term, medium, and long-term goals or tasks in order to meet that future vision of what your county might look like? I think strategic planning can be done very small and very casual. I don't know that you need to bring in a consultant. I don't know that you need to pay big money for a consultant. It depends on how well your organization board of directors talks to one another. Maybe a facilitator. A facilitator and a consultant are not necessarily the same thing, but someone who can keep the conversation moving, take one section of the conversation, close it down, come to an agreement on tasks, and then move on to the next section. And then when it's time, close that one down, take notes, and move on to the next. SWOT analysis, I think you can just do at a board meeting. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And it's fine to talk about things, but you need to develop a list of tasks and who's going to do them and the due date for doing them, which goes back to that why agenda. And then routinely check to make sure that the tasks that you agreed were going to be done actually got done. Next slide. Solicit feedback. This is so hard for people. My quote there is from the founder of the Community Foundation. If your friends don't tell you, your enemies surely won't. Now, I know that's different with a local unit of government because the radio station and the newspaper and others come along and report on what you've done because you are a local unit of government, and it goes on the radio station Facebook page like it does here in Grundy County, and oh my God, the people rip and tear and snarl, and because they just don't understand fully what you do. But anyway, but since you are a grant-making organization, and we're going to, Section 12, I think, talks about grant-making organizations, you still need to get feedback, structured feedback from the nonprofits that you serve and the citizens that they serve. Next slide, 4S, analyze the data. Analyze and apply all meaningful data through evaluation of the governing body, the board of directors, the programs and the operations to increase accountability and effectiveness. Is it on the next? Let's go to the next slide. Right, the dashboard. My problem is that sometimes a nonprofit has a hard time figuring out what data they want to collect and what data truly is meaningful. In the early days, most social service nonprofits will say, okay, this month we served 87 people. The food pantry gave away 12,000 pounds of food, et cetera. And that's all nice numeric information, but then how do you collect and measure the impact? How do you measure the impact of mental health? And it isn't always going to be a nice, tidy, numeric answer. It's going to be incredibly subjective. It depends on the person with the mental health issue. It depends on whether they are moving along the path to wellness or whether they are stuck where they are. I serve on the Grundy County Drug Court, and I have since inception back in 2005. And in some ways, this is the hardest part of what we do, is trying to put to words the impact of drug court in Grundy County. Again, this is something to pass along and share and have a conversation with your grant recipients. What data do they collect to report back to you? Is it kind of ho-hum? Because if so, you probably ought to have a conversation with them about more robust reporting, more robust data collection. But they may need funding from you in order to do that. A dashboard is just simply the visual, and I put there in the very last thing, easy to create in Excel. If you put a set of data in Excel, you can then highlight that, right-click, create a graph, and then from there, do you want it to be a bar graph, a pie graph, whatever the case may be. Do you want it on the x-axis, the y-axis? If it's not something you're good at, holler. I'll find you somebody who is good at doing it. If you're anything like me, I'm a visual learner, and so I love graphics like this, pie charts, bar charts, whatever the case may be. Next. Section 5 talks about the full membership of the governing body is responsible for the organization. So that's definitely you guys. And each member acts at all times in an ethical manner and in the best interest of the organization and the public. So we're going back to the 3 duties of care, loyalty, and obedience. So a 501c3 nonprofit is required to file a 990 with the federal government every year. And when you are a small nonprofit, you can, when you're super small, you can do a postcard or online. And then once your annual revenue gets to a certain level, then you have to complete and submit a full-fledged 990. So when you think about your own personal finances, some of us can just do a 1040 EZ, and then some of us with more complicated investments and dividends and all that kind of stuff, we have to complete a full 1040. This is the same thing, just different term. So a nonprofit does a 990. You are asked by the federal government, by the IRS, whether you have a conflict of interest policy. For you guys, it's more under state of Illinois ethics and things like that. In the nonprofit world, a conflict of interest doesn't mean you have to eliminate the conflict. It just means that it has to be divulged and that the person with the conflict cannot participate in conversations, et cetera. So for example, in my county, we have a very big name contractor. And then when you get into cousins and in-laws and stuff like that who have absolutely no economic interest in that company, there's still a perceived conflict that the family with the big name is influencing the decisions of the nonprofit. You probably have that at the 708 board as well. So you've got a member of the 708 board with a locally famous last name and a cousin of an in-law with the same last name is serving on the board at this nonprofit grantee. It doesn't mean that the grant can't happen. It's just that you guys have to divulge the fact that, yes, we have the same last name, but we're so far apart on the family tree, there's no economic conflict or anything like that. So, and especially in rural America, rural Illinois, big story out of the Tribune a decade ago saying absolutely no person should serve on more than one nonprofit board. And our coffee club looked at each other and went, well, that doesn't work in rural America. We need as many people volunteering as we can. And sometimes you do serve on more than one board of director. So next. Again, back to the 990s, we have to adopt a whistleblower policy. This all comes out of Enron and ADM, and it basically just says that an employee who goes through the grievance filing process within the organization to report fiscal malfeasance, they shall not be punished for blowing the whistle on the bad fiscal activities. So I don't know how much you have to do about that with a 708. Next slide, and then documentation, document retention policy, another policy required by a 990 for a 501c3, but I'm pretty sure that local units of government have something very, very similar. How long do you have to keep documents? Which ones have to be on paper? Which ones can be electronic? If they're paper, do they have to stay forever? And if they can be destroyed someday in the future, how's that going to happen? Is it going to be shredder? Is it going to be nobody? I don't know. Maybe in rural America we burn it out in the barrel. But anyway, figure out what that is. And the very bottom one, a document retention policy is not to be confused with confidentiality and privacy, which we are going to cover in a little bit. Next slide. So all of this, I ask you again, I'm repeating an earlier question. Is your 708 board going to do only what's legally required by Illinois statute? Or are you going to design your board activities around best practices of governments and nonprofits? Next slide, section 6. The governing body and staff are aware of and comply with all federal, state, and local laws, regulations, and fiduciary responsibilities applicable to the nonprofit. Next slide. Just 6A just talks about the basics of running an organization. Everybody on your board should have a little bit of a primer to know about basic accounting, the legal requirements of your organization, whether you need to do an audit, information about taxes, and definitely a little bit of a primer about employment law. Now, 708 board, do you do it alone? Do you piggyback on the county? My husband is the superintendent of the Veterans Assistance Commission of Grundy, and his board is all appointed by the posts, the units, and the ships in the county, so he doesn't get to choose who serves on his board. The funding comes from the county, and his HR, his payroll, and everything is handled by the county. So I don't know how your 708 board interacts with the county in the big picture. So you guys may not need to know that much about employment law because you've got a county department that handles all the HR issues regarding your chief executive. So take from that what you will. Next slide. Lobbying laws, not necessarily for you guys, but definitely for nonprofits. And that may be a bridge between the nonprofits that you grant and whether they are out lobbying to the county board, to the General Assembly in Springfield, or to the feds out in DC. Next, administrative expenditures. Definitely you guys are out setting an annual budget. How much can the CEO spend without your approval? For me, it's $10,000, just as an example. Anything beyond that, I need the executive committee to approve it. Who can sign legal documents on behalf of the organization? How many signatures on bank checks? For a nonprofit, especially during the pandemic, these things really got edited because you couldn't physically go into the bank. So then we started online banking, but then the question became, it's too easy for someone to embezzle when they're the only one who has the password for the online banking. So things like that. And then us nonprofits have company credit cards. So who gets to have it and what are their limits? For my organization as CEO, my credit card limit, I think, is $25,000, but my program director, her limit is $2,500. So more than one person can have a credit card for the company, but it doesn't mean they have the same spending limit. Next slide. Board resolutions. I see these a lot more in local units of government than I do in nonprofits, but resolutions are not only for the fancy, for the feel-good situations. Oh, somebody's celebrating an anniversary. They've been employed by the county for 45 years. We're going to do a resolution, and our state rep is going to do one down on the floor in the Illinois House. Those are the feel-good ones, but you can also do a board resolution to be stronger than board minutes. So let's say this nonprofit is buying a 10-acre piece of property. That's going to be a big ticket item. More than just board minutes, it would be nice if that nonprofit board put together a resolution and the board voted on the resolution. It's just stronger language than minutes. I have a sample of that. If anybody wants to see them, holler to Jody and I'll make sure that they get sent. Internal controls, policies and procedures to prevent financial fraud. The person who opens the mail doesn't do the banking, that type of thing. Preventing disclosure of confidential information. A peer of mine got into deep trouble because she wasn't paying attention. She had a check from a donor and a huge dollar amount sitting on her desk when a different donor came in and just happened to look down and see the check with the name of the donor, the dollar amount, and that started this whole gossip thingamabob around town. And she got in trouble for not protecting the identity of that donor and all that other good stuff. So I know that sounds a little far-fetched, but we all know, especially in rural Illinois and gossip factor, and everybody knows everybody. So just be aware that weird little stuff like that happens. Client information, definitely with you guys working in the mental health field, making sure that the nonprofits that you grant are incredibly cautious about how they collect and protect client information. And then a clear chain of command. Purchasing, and then again, this may not be you guys, this may be the county who does the depreciation of this, that, and the other thing. Next slide. 6E is risk management. Again, it may not be you, it may be the county board, but the nonprofit grantees that you serve, do they have their unemployment insurance, workers' comp, general liability, D&O, directors and officers insurance? Small nonprofits go, oh, we can't afford D&O, we don't want D&O, blah, 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 but it is the asterisk there. Is that required by Illinois law? I'm not quite sure, but my premium is only $1,000 a year, and I say only. For some small nonprofits, that $1,000 a year may be huge, but for a 501c3 without D&O insurance, those individual board members have just put their homes and vehicles on the line should the organization ever get served. So, you don't want the nonprofit grant recipients to not have D&O, which would put your grant money at risk should they ever get sued. Again, I know it sounds really far-fetched, but it's happened. Next slide. Number 7, governing body exercises active oversight of the financial affairs, policies, appropriate. Next slide. So every financial report should include the budget, the balance sheet, and the profit and loss statements. I'm a big advocate for cash flow, and that could be your 708 boards as well. A cash flow statement is simply an Excel spreadsheet. On the left-hand side, you have your chart of accounts. Across the top, you have January through December. The next to last column on the right is year to date, and then the very last column is budget. And I would like to see more nonprofits use these because, especially with you being a grantor, they need to know what time of year they can expect that grant money to come in, because they may have a cash flow problem if they're broke in May and your grant check to them isn't going to arrive until June 15th or July 15th because they have a July 1 start date or whatever the case may be. So just making sure that the nonprofits that you serve are not desperate during certain times of year, because you don't want them to have to go get loans or lines of credit or squeeze in a golf outing or whatever the case may be. Next slide. Audits. 501c3s of a certain size. So for example, Forefront in Chicago just got legislation through in May, raising the audit threshold for nonprofits in Illinois. It used to be $300,000. Now it's $500,000 of annual budget. So if your nonprofit in Illinois has annual budget of $500,000 a year or higher, you do have to have an audit. If it's less than that, you don't. Personally, I think that's doing a huge disservice to the small nonprofits because that gives them an awful lot of time and years to do things wrong or illegal, etc., and nobody's going to find it. So audits are not always about money. They're about making sure that policies and procedures are being followed. As a 708 board, I'm assuming your, I'm going to say department audit is part of the big county audit. I don't know that, but anyway. So I'm just throwing that out there. And in my early days, our very first audit was clean. Auditor found nothing wrong with us. And our treasurer at the time, who was a big business owner, he went, well, then we have the wrong auditor because we are brand new. There's no way that we're doing everything perfectly straight out of the gate. So I just throw out that little tidbit. Next, Section 8, the organization maintains appropriate cybersecurity safeguards. I think we're all hearing, my husband and I watched 60 Minutes. It was just in the last 6 months, some tiny little town down in Alabama got hacked. The entire, when I say entire village, they had a population of probably 5,000 or less, but screwed up absolutely everything for this tiny little municipality because they didn't have the money to pay it, and it ruined, you know, let's just say the water department, the billing for the water department. What a giant headache. So for your 708 board, what type of cybersecurity do you have? And for the nonprofits that you grant to, what do they have in place? Next slide. So 8A through E talks about all these different things. When you get your copy of the book, you can read what they are specifically. Does your 708 board get to use the county in-house IT? But then again, what about your grantees? Making sure that their data is secure for their clients, their donors, et cetera. You don't want that hacked and get out, especially because of stigma. We don't need our residents with mental health diagnoses, we don't need their names being publicized. When it comes to cybersecurity, I surely do not have the skill set to do that. A lot of people try to do it on the cheap, and I think they get in trouble later. So I think cybersecurity is one of those issues like D&O insurance where you just have to pay the money to have it done right and save yourself a lot of headache and money in the long run. And then intellectual property. My story here, I was at a conference a few years ago, and a man told the story. He and his wife are big supporters of the local animal shelter. So they took it upon themselves to do a fundraiser just on Facebook among their family and friends. Hey, we love ABC Animal Shelter. Will you please make a donation? Here's a link to their website. And here are the photos of the really cute puppies and kittens that they have rescued. And a few weeks later, that donor and his wife got a cease and desist letter from the animal shelter that you don't have permission to use our photos. And so guess what? That donor and his wife are not financially supporting that shelter ever again because it was just a little too protective. What do you mean we can't use the photos of your animals? We're trying to raise money so that these animals, you know, more animals get rescued type of thing. But as a 708 board giving grants to the nonprofits out in the community, I suggest that you ask them what's their level of cybersecurity, what are their policies around their intellectual property, whether it's photos, definitely the confidentiality photos or lack of photos of their clients. Then you're getting into children, that type of thing, and their blog posts, etc. Next slide. Especially for the nonprofits, how and when are they posting on their websites, their social media? There's a marketing plan, and then there's a social media calendar, and there is a difference between the two of them, but that's another webinar. I also suggest that every organization, whether it's yours, whether it's a grantee, have an official spokesperson. In my organization, it is our board chair. Now, have we been at a press conference and the board chair gets up and says, "This is my name, I'm the board chair, I'm happy to be here, I'm very excited about this, but here's Julie to tell you all the gory details." So, and then moving down to the nightmares of modern times, if any of your communities have a talk of the town or any of that stuff on Facebook, holy cow, the negative comments can be absolutely inaccurate and mean and spiteful. So if, when, how, why are you going to post, which would invite the public to comment? Or are you going to make a policy that you're just not going to do that? Or you're going to make a policy that we're going to post, but we're not going to allow comments? But how does that fall under the Open Meetings Act? So it isn't an easy cut and dried situation. And then the First Amendment rights of your board and staff. I don't know that I even need to say more about that, but you need a policy and procedure about it, and you definitely need to bring in an employment lawyer to help you figure it out, and or find a policy that passes legal muster in Illinois that someone else has already adopted and ask if you can borrow theirs. Next slide, Section 9. The nonprofit responsibly collects, maintains, and properly disposes of personally identifiable information received from donors, employees, volunteers, and clients. So here we're into confidentiality. Next slide, 9A. So protecting those you serve. Every nonprofit should have a piece of paper called an "I promise to keep confidential" type piece of paper, and have the individual sheets and individual people sign them. They do it once a year. And my mom was a volunteer at Morris Hospital for the longest time, and we'd be at family dinner and she'd go, "Oh, so-and-so had a stroke." And we're like, "Well, how do you know that?" She goes, "Because he was in the hospital." And we're like, "Mom, you're not supposed to say those things." And she'd just look at us with this hand swipe and go, "Everybody knows." I'm like, "Well, obviously I did not know." There are a lot of people who don't take this seriously. And especially in the mental health realm, you have to take it seriously. So in addition to having a policy that somebody signs, what's your policy for reprimand and correction should they violate that confidentiality policy? Next slide. Take stock of what you collect. This is more for the nonprofit world, but grantors, foundations, funders are starting to ask more and more questions about the demographics of who you serve. They're also changing the terminology. So in the old days, it was how many male, how many female. Now they're asking how many male, how many female, how many non-binary, how many choose to not disclose. So they have to be ready for stuff like that. The second one, my husband ran into this when he started with the Veterans Assistance Commission. He started asking the food pantries and some of the others, how many of your clients are veterans? And they said, well, we don't know, we don't ask. And he said, well, please ask, because if you have a veteran that you are serving, you can send them over to me. I will serve them to the best of my ability and free up your money to serve your clients who are not veterans. So it isn't always a gotcha question. It's sometimes a collaboration question. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm in a couple of private Facebook groups for nonprofit executives. And 6 months ago, someone came on and said, wow, a grant application is asking how many people on my board are LGBTQ. And we've never asked that of the board before, and I don't know what to do next. And so many people came on and attacked this asker. You're being homophobic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, at the end, she came on and said, wait a minute, I forgot to tell you all, we're an animal shelter. So it's not like I'm being attacked for not having representation of animals on my board, but animals don't have sexuality or gender, et cetera. So it's not relevant to our services whether I have LGBTQ board members. And so she apologized for not putting that up front. But in the mental health world, your grantees will be encountering these types of questions. Maybe their services are specific for people who are LGBTQ or non-binary, or maybe straight male, straight female. So if so, you may want to encourage them to make sure that they have representation on their board, to be another set of eyes and ears and a voice to make sure that their services are, what's the word I'm looking for? Make sure that their services are available to all the different citizens in the county who may be seeking services from them. Next, protecting the information. So even the physical stuff like locking cabinets, security codes on computers, you don't want somebody in that department sneaking into your office and getting on your computer and going through your database of clients with mental health diagnosis. Anonymity of clients, the story about local suicides. So we have a behavioral health alliance here in Grundy County, and we'd like to do a lot of suicide prevention messaging, but we never do it when someone local has died of suicide because we don't want the gossip factor out there. Oh, they just put out a set of tips about, I bet they're talking about Bill. Bill killed himself last week. No. Maybe when Robin Williams died, or maybe when Amy Winehouse died, or maybe when Anthony Bourdain died. When a celebrity somewhere else in the world dies of suicide, we use that opportunity to do community messaging around suicide, because then we know the readers are not trying to figure out behind the scenes, who are we gossiping about? Because we're not gossiping, and we're not gossiping about anybody local. And again, destroying client information, how are you going to do it? And there's a link here to U of I and their recommended policy that any of us can cut and paste for destruction of client information. Next, 9F, plan ahead. This is more for the nonprofit world, but especially around mental health messaging. Use the examples from around the world and put together a plan of messaging for how you would do it in Grundy County, or how you would do it in Sangamon County, or whatever the case may be. Next slide, section 10. The nonprofit embraces transparency and accountability by making information about its mission, program, activities, and outcomes, and finances available to the public, and communicates it in a clear, timely, and proactive manner. Next slide. Open Meetings Act, but not your 501c3s. So how do you communicate and collaborate with them to make sure that they are transparent and held accountable? They can post their 990 on the website. They might want to do their audit. I suggest all of you list your board members. You're definitely not going to give home addresses and phone numbers and things like that. They still need to contact the board members through the organization, knock on wood. But if they, especially here in rural Illinois, I bump into my donors at the grocery store all the time, as do my board members. And so my board members are equipped with some tidbits, et cetera, from me. So if they do encounter somebody at the grocery store who says, hey, you guys, Julie had that story out last week and I have a question about it, they at least have a little bit of knowledge that they can talk to people when they bump into them. And easier to talk about programs, outcomes, and impact. Next slide. Statement of functional expense. I would think that your 708 board would want to really understand this. Nonprofits who receive, especially government contract grants, et cetera. One thing they teach you in grant writing school is that, yes, you've got the programs, you know the staff you need, you know the supplies that you need, but you also need to add 10%, 15%, whatever, to your grant application because you have to pay your portion of the electric bill, your portion of the gas bill, your portion of the water bill, your portion of the CEO salary, your portion of the rent or the mortgage or whatever the case may be. So a food pantry does not operate in a vacuum. Food pantries take up a lot of square footage. They take up a lot of electricity. They take up a lot of, especially the electricity for the big giant refrigerators and freezers and stuff like that. Now the volunteers are free and the food is donated, but it still costs money to run that food pantry. So I know this is difficult to read, but talk with any of your grantees. They probably are very, very good at doing this. And if you don't yet ask this type of question or don't yet grant a percentage on top of the program expenses, you're not doing the nonprofit any favors because they still need to operate. They still need staff. They need a roof over their head. They need electricity, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide. This is not you, but it is the nonprofits that you serve. Section 11 talks all about fundraising. Next slide. AFP stands for the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and they have a list of donor bill of rights that you can download. Next slide. Section 12 talks about grant-making organizations. That's me, that's you as a 708 board. We establish, follow, and clearly communicate processes for receiving, reviewing, and acting on grant applications, and for monitoring and evaluating grants that are made. And we act fairly and responsibly in considering the funding needs of potential grantees. Next slide. We already talked a couple of slides back about the full cost of running a program. So we talked about that. Next slide. Communicate clearly and timely with grantees. Be very clear upfront. These are the parameters of the grant. This is what the grant application looks like. Have these documents ready before you even begin filling out the grant application. They are due by this date. We will make a decision by this date, and your check shall arrive by this date. Be very, very clear. Otherwise, staff is going to be answering questions 24/7, especially in the rush before a grant application is due. Next slide. It's hard to deliver bad news, but you got to do it. And if you can be timely and professional about it, the nonprofits, hopefully, knock on wood, will accept rejection a lot better. So make sure that if you receive a grant application, it is reviewed and it is denied, rejected, not funded, whatever terminology you use, make sure that you convey that information to them as soon as possible. And then if you have the opportunity, I think the nonprofit would appreciate constructive criticism. Next slide. 12F, the reporting, clearly communicate what data you're looking for. That ought to be in the grant application. If you are successful receiving this grant, you will need to provide the following data. Therefore, how do you plan to collect the data? That should be in the grant application. Next slide. Due diligence. Assure that your board's evaluation and assessment of a grantee's implementation of the grant meets your expectations and that the citizens are well served as a result. I'm big with the word expectations. A lot of it comes from, I use it a lot as a parent. I expect you to get good grades. I expect you to brush your teeth before you go to bed. We have a list of expectations of board members that we use when we are courting a person in the community to be on our board. I expect you to attend our monthly board meetings on the third Thursday at 7:30 in the morning. We expect you to show up at evening events. We expect that you will speak up when you have something controversial, et cetera. So make sure that you communicate to your grantees your expectations. Next slide. 13 is the last one. Invest in and perform appropriate diligence to get to know your people. Next slide. If you're not aware of it, at the national level, it's called SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management. My local one happens to be Will and Grundy counties. The membership is incredibly affordable. I don't know if you need it as a 708 board, if you rely on the county HR department, but the grantees of yours may want to, you want to assure that they have the proper channels and resources for accessing HR law policies and procedures and things like that. Next slide. Make sure you have job descriptions for staff, board, and your volunteers. The volunteers who come in and administer the food pantry, the volunteers who drive the hospital van, that type of stuff. Even though they're not being paid, they have to have a job description. Next slide, 13C, diligence. If you and your grantees both, you probably ought to do a background check on anybody who's going to be involved with their financials, whether they're volunteer board or whether they're paid staff. And then anyone who interacts with what I'm going to say sensitive clients, those involved with domestic violence, seniors, children, mental health. Next slide. So performance metrics, it's all very cyclical. So a lot of nonprofits don't do this. The board hires, fires, and reprimands one person, and that is the executive, the highest ranking paid staff person. That person then hires, fires, reprimands, and rewards everybody else. And depending on the chain of command and your workflow and all that other stuff, the board works with the CEO to put together a plan of work for the following year. That CEO then goes to their department heads and helps them develop a plan of work for the following year. They then meet with their staff to develop a plan of work. Then the supervisors meet with their staff periodically to get feedback and reports, and then they feed it up to their supervisor, who feeds it to the CEO, who feeds it to the board. So it just keeps going round and round in a perfect world that everybody's doing their job, reflecting on their job, making recommendations for change in order to make the world better, et cetera, and that everybody does that with thoughtfulness and timeliness, and kumbaya, the organization flows really, really well. Next slide. Keep a clear line of authority. I already said this, so we'll skip that one. Next slide. And don't forget to do performance metrics and annual reviews of volunteers. Just because they're a volunteer doesn't mean that they can screw up on the job. You can't have a food pantry volunteer making sexual advances to the clients. You can't have a food pantry volunteer using foul language. You probably don't want a food pantry volunteer who's always late and always leaves early. So back to the job descriptions. This is the job description that you are signing on to, and these are the reprimand steps that we can take, excuse me, if you fall short on all those types of things. Same thing with the board. your 708 board might be elected, but I would think and hope that statute gives you the opportunity to reprimand or remove a board member who is not acting in the legal sense of the organization as well as the ethical sense of the organization. Next slide. So all sorts of resources here, whether you use them yourself, whether you pass them on to your grantees, totally up to you. Next slide. So Jody, that's the end of my official presentation, and it's 1:14, and so we have time for Q&A. If anybody has typed them in, can you read them to me?
Absolutely. Hold on just a second. Okay. Just going through here. I don't see any questions right now. So if anybody does have a question, feel free to raise your hand or you can post it into the chat box. And that was very great. It was a good presentation. Thank you, Julie, by the way.
You're welcome. If you go to the next slide, that's how people can find me. So
let me put it.
I had a question.
Okay.
I had a question, Jody.
Yeah.
Julie, when you talked about audits and the change to 500,000 from 300,000, and you know, that we do know that we fund some smaller organizations, and we changed our funding guidelines to reduce that for those organizations. We do still ask for accountability for like financial statements, which don't require the full-blown audit, but they can get a financial statement. And we also ask them for quarterly financial reports and do some other things in way of doing that. Does that sound reasonable from your experience and knowledge?
It does, and in fact, I've even said to small nonprofits, pay a local CPA outside your organization, just pay them a couple $100 to just do an audit light, or like you said, a financial review. That accountant will know where to look for unusual activity. And in fact, that's usually the term I type in my board minutes. No unusual activity to report regarding our financials. A big swing, if you see a giant swing of money coming in, where'd that come from? If you see a nonprofit with a giant swing of money going out, why? And I'm not saying it's wrong, but they need to be able to confidently report that to themselves and back to you. And again, if audits are not just financial, you want to make sure that any of their policies and procedures. So the person who opens the mail should not be the person doing the banking, because that gives them the opportunity to pocket checks. Instead of depositing them in the nonprofit bank account, they deposit them in their personal. But since nobody saw that money come in, nobody knows that money didn't get deposited until the donor or whoever calls and says, wait a minute, I sent you a check for $5,000 and it cleared, but the signature on the back is not from your organization, and stuff like that. So I think you are absolutely on the right track that if they're too small to do an audit, there are still financial and policy and procedure ways that you can give oversight and help them prove to them that whatever they're doing is on the up and up and that they know what they're doing.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from folks? Okay.
All right. Well, Jody, if you have that last slide up.
I do. Yep.
A little bit of background. So my day job is the Community Foundation of Grundy County. I operate only in Grundy County, but I've started teaching and consulting and stuff like that. So my board gave me permission to do consulting outside of Grundy County, provided that it's not somebody who would do business with the Community Foundation. So there are a lot of nonprofits based in Will that receive grants from the Community Foundation of Grundy to do services in Grundy. So and I'm kind of building something toward my retirement gig. So my consulting outside of Grundy is called Nonprofit Brains and Brawn. So I can answer just any old regular questions. I'm happy to do it at the office. But if you need something beyond that, I'm also available for consulting.
Great. Appreciate that. And I will share these slides, correct? It's okay if we all share them. I'm working on a newsletter today, so we'll get that out with a link to the recording as well as the handouts from today. If there's anything else you had, I'm happy to share it as well.
Yeah, I will send the link to the Purple Book, the Attorney General book that was the basis of my presentation today. So between the handouts, the recording, and the Purple Book, everybody should be well equipped, and they're going to have plenty of reading to do. It's kind of dry, but necessary to have a successful organization.
Definitely. Well, we appreciate it. I learned a lot. So thank you so much for your time and everybody for joining us today. And we'll be sending out this information probably by the end of the day.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.